I have been asked to talk about David and Jonathan this morning. And so that's what I'll be looking at. And it's a narrative passage. So there's a couple of things I'd like to just say about narrative passages before we really dive into that. First of all, and Chris has pointed this out a few times as well as we were going through Samuel, that we must be careful about drawing theological truths from narrative texts. There is lots of things recorded in the Bible that are not really good to do. The interesting thing is that you would think that if the Hebrews wanted a history of their nation, that the people who wrote that history would be, skating around and glossing over the not so great parts and exaggerating the good parts, but in fact that's anything but the case. In fact, the history of Israel has been largely not that great. There have been brief times where they loved God and served God, but there were a lot of times when they did not. So, and it records those things. It records what people did. It records like David and his big colossal case of adultery and arranging for the murder of her husband. One of the so-called big heroes, and he was a man after God's own heart, simply because I think that he deeply and totally repented when confronted with his sin by the prophet Nathan. So we got to be careful about that, but at the same time, where do we get our teaching from? Well, we usually get the things that we can really bank on from didactic or teaching portions of the scriptures. But the narrative texts give us real-life examples of what to do and what not to do. So it works together. The didactic or teaching portions of the Bible give us the nice, clear instructions about how we ought to live and what we ought not to do and to do. But the narrative portions give us a thousand years, more than a few thousand years of examples of what happens when you take different routes. So the other thing is that a narrative account can also give us encouragement on how to live today, and that's what I hope you'll see when I talk about David and Jonathan, that you will find that that account of their friendship to be enormously encouraging to you when you think of how Jesus has asked you to love your neighbor as yourself, or as it was stated with Jonathan, to love your neighbor as your own soul. There's another thing to remember, and that is, it states in Romans that whatever was written in former times or former days was written for our instructions. And when he's talking about the former days, at the time when he wrote the book of Romans, he's talking about the Old Testament. The Old Testament was written for our instruction. So even though maybe the covenant given at Mount Sinai was broken, and he states that in Jeremiah chapter 31, and a new covenant, not like, to quote Jeremiah 31, not like the old covenant, is now in place. The Old Testament is still extremely relevant today in terms of watching how God responds to a wide variety of situations throughout the millennia, and watching the lives of people who did both good and bad, and seeing the long-term consequences and short-term consequences of their own sin. Today it's mostly good, except for one thing at the end. So don't completely nod. If you do nod off, just be sure to set your alarm to wake up near the end of the talk. So first of all, for the account of David and Jonathan, we need to set the historical context here. In 1400 BC, the Israelites were primarily agrarian, from 1400 up to the time of the first king, which was when this relationship between David and Jonathan began. So for 400 years, they lived primarily as sheep and goat herders, vineyard producers. They had no king, no real government, but they had instead, you might call it a theocracy. God was their king. However, in that theocracy, the people were free to not do what God desired them to do. And I think God's moral laws that he gave Israel, and even to us today, are designed to maximize human flourishing and minimize human suffering. But there were many times throughout their history they decided, no, we're not going to do that. And so God, in various places, stated, okay, then you will learn what it's like to live under different human rulers and different human invaders and governments. And this is what occurs here. This is the situation that occurred began to occur around 1200 BC. So around 1200 BC, an event occurred described as the late Bronze Age collapse. And there was a mass migration of the Philistine sea people from the Aegean area of the Mediterranean to the coast of ancient Israel. And ancient Egyptian records from Ramesses III describe this mass migration. Interestingly enough, God in Amos chapter 9, verse 7 said that he brought the Philistines to Israel. He brought them to Israel for a purpose, and that is as a way of, demonstrating or allowing Israel to experience what happens when they abandon their own Lord and God and King. So the Philistines arrived by the tens of thousands, beginning about 200 years before this account. Probably more than 100, 200, we don't know exactly how many thousand. And they totally decimated the Israelite population. They disarmed them. They subjugated them, the surviving population, as their servants and slaves. And it actually states in the book of Judges that the Philistines ruled, quote, ruled over Israel. And of course, they didn't want any problem, as any government does when they want to make sure the citizens are behaving themselves. They disarmed the Israelites, so that swords, spears, and blacksmiths even were banned. So if they wanted to have their plowshare sharpened or their scythe, their sickle, they had to go to a Philistine blacksmith and pay, and the price is given there in the text. It's actually quite a hefty price. Now you might think, well, why didn't they just make their own like swords and things out of scrap iron? Scrap iron was not a thing back then. Iron, it was the beginning of the Iron Age. Iron was very valuable. It's beginning to replace brass. It was much stronger, much more durable as plowshares. So they had what little bit iron they had was used for producing food, plowshares, scythes, and so forth. So that's the situation. And around about 900, between 900 and 1000 BC, between 1000 and 1100 BC, I always get mixed up working backwards, Jonathan decided one day to attack a Philistine garrison at Geba. And he was successful. Jonathan was the next in line for the throne of Israel behind the first king, which was Saul, his father. And so the Philistines realized we got a bit of an insurrection here. We're going to have to do something about this. And they amassed an army of, quote, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand on the seashore at Michmash. Now, this is why I gave you the context, is you wonder, where in the world are they getting all this massive pile of people? Well, it was a consequence of this mass migration over the past 200 years. Now, without telling his father, Jonathan decided to enter the enemy camp with his young armor bearer, who was probably in his late teens. And he decided between him and his armor bearer, they were going to attack tens of thousands of soldiers. And this is probably why he didn't tell his dad what his plan was, because it's not a very good plan. However, Jonathan said this. He said to the young man, keep in mind that after this army had been assembled, Israel fled into caves, holes in the ground. The army started melting away because, keep in mind, it states that around that time he attacked the garrison, there were only 2 swords in all Israel. Saul the king had one, Jonathan had one, and I guess the rest of them just had pointy sticks and maybe their sickle. But you're going against well-armed people who not only have swords and spears and shields, but also have armor, body armor on. And we know that from some of the description of Goliath and the weight of the various pieces of weaponry and armor that he had. So there was a standoff, not really a standoff. The Philistines had not yet attacked. And it was pretty obvious that there's only 2 options here. One is just sit here and wait till they attack and we're going to get obliterated. Or B, Jonathan in his mind says, what's the point of standing around here? We're dead men. Let's go and attack them, you and I, he says to the armor bearer. And so they do. Either way, it wasn't a good situation to be in, but I think what Jonathan says here explains a lot about the foundation, or what it was, the catalyst for his relationship with David. So let's read what he said. So he said to the young man who carried his armor, "Let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." And his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." And don't you love that guy? Oh man, he's in his late teens. And this plan pretty much means they're dead men. And he is just 100% behind. But the key thing I think here about Jonathan is something that he believes about God, and that God doesn't need massive armies or whatever to accomplish his goal. It doesn't matter. Like one guy, 10,000, doesn't really matter. If God wants to do something, he's going to do it. And Jonathan is just saying, well, I'm hoping that this is what God, it seems that God doesn't need a whole army here, so let's go do it, and maybe he will bring something to pass. So, so they do attack, him and his armor bearer. And it says that in the first few minutes, they drop 20 of the Philistines. So here they come. There's two guys. The Philistines are thousands, tens of thousands. We don't know exactly the numbers. They say the two Israelite guys come over up onto the plateau there. And so they're not all concerned. You know, Joe can handle that. You know, they're already expecting him, Jonathan, his armor bearer. But to their amazement, Jonathan starts swinging with the only sword he has, the one of two swords in all of Israel. And he starts dropping Philistines right there. And they were totally shocked. And then some of the other guys run to help, and they get killed. And then to top it all off, the account says an earthquake began, and the ground started heaving and shaking. And when you take, say, a pan of kitty litter and start, assuming that's dry and clean, and you go like this, dust comes out. And so you got to picture what was going on here. They see just two guys, no problem here, and then all of a sudden they see, oh, there's a bit of a problem. Oh, there's a bigger problem. Then the ground is shaking, the dust is rising, and then some of the guys who have not faced them yet, they say, I'm out of here. Like, this is crazy. These berserkers are they're amazing. So they start running, a few guys, but then that triggers a few more, and next thing you know, the entire Philistine army is fleeing from David and Jonathan. Now, I won't go into the rest of the account. That's kind of just the setup for the kind of man Jonathan was. Now, keep in mind, his armor bearer was probably just not some random teenager that just happened to show up that day. As the son of the king, next in line to the throne, I'm sure that Jonathan got some choice in the matter. He selected who's going to be his armor bearer, and he selected a man like himself, a young man like himself. You can see this courage, heart and soul, I'm with you. And so this trait, this character trait within Jonathan was something he appeared to have looked for in his armor bearer. So when he meets David, he's going to meet a man with a similar trait. And I think this is the key thing that unites them. Now, along comes David. So David is a shepherd. He's out there looking after the sheep, but he brings some supplies to his brothers. And he sees this Goliath, and I think you've covered that adequately enough. I just want to point one statement out that David makes as he in his shepherd's thing and his slingshot comes up against Goliath. And Goliath is a big man. He's 9.5 feet tall, roughly. And the weight, like his spearhead, just the head of his spear was the same weight of a full can of paint. You stick that on the end of a stick, a full can of paint, and try heaving that. This is the kind of person Goliath was. And he would have considered, in fact, he did consider it to be an insult when David came up to him. But David says this, "You come to me with a spear, with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And we all know the story, and that's the end of Goliath. So again, you see this the armies of Israel are back there, and don't think that they all are well armed. They may have picked up some weapons that the Philistines dropped when they were fleeing earlier, but still they are vastly underarmed in comparison to the Philistines, and they're not doing a thing. They're scared silly. David isn't. He just thinks, well, this has got to be done. And he decides to do what has to be done and has no concern for how difficult it will be, trusting that God will make up for his 2 fish and 5 loaves, so to speak. He has 2 fish, 5 loaves. God has everything else, and he steps up and accomplishes what needs to be done. So after this, when he brings Goliath's head to King Saul, David gives an account to King Saul and engages in conversation with him. And then it says this: as soon as David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This is right there within the context of David just having done something as crazy as Jonathan had done when he went against an entire army with just him and his armor bearer. David has done something similar, and he sees a man, a kindred spirit, a man after his own heart. There's a bonding that occurs right there. This man, not only, they're a courageous people, but they're just foolish. But this is not that kind of person here. Both of them had a genuine belief that God doesn't need us to work in our normal ways. If there's a job that needs to be done, let's just move ahead and do it, and then he will ensure that it happens. Now note that this is not Jonathan writing this account. It is not Jonathan saying that he loved David as his own soul. This is the person recording this. And we're told by Peter, the Apostle Peter, that the people who recorded in the scriptures, they were not speaking on their own or doing their own interpretation, but moved by the Holy Spirit recorded this. And so what we're seeing here is a description of what God's perspective was of how Jonathan bonded to David. So the main theme of what I want to talk about is emerging right here. We're about to see what it looks like when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, or love your neighbor as your own soul, which would be equivalent. Now, 4 centuries earlier at Mount Sinai, God had given a command to the Israelites, and he said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Just reminding them who's giving them that command. Then, that's 4 centuries before this event. About just over 1,000 years later, Jesus said basically the same thing. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so this is why I mentioned that the things written in former times, the narrative events and the things that occurred, can actually be a great encouragement to us. When we see other people who have gone ahead and they have truly loved someone as their own soul, and then we see Christ's command and we see how that person worked it out. So let's now take a look at Jonathan and David. So back to the hours immediately after David defeated Goliath. It says, then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. Now, let's just pause right there before we look at the other verse. That was an incredible thing. I mean, the sword was a huge gift right there. Now, David took Goliath's sword, but that thing is kind of like, well, what are you going to do with this thing? It weighs like 25 or 30 pounds, whereas Jonathan's sword would have been made for David. Now, later on, David does take possession of that sword because it's the only one he can get his hands on. But at that moment, Jonathan gave David all his armor. And we don't value armor today, of course, like they did even in medieval times, where armor was a very costly thing to acquire, and even more so here where they lived under their Philistine masters and they were not even allowed blacksmiths. But then there's something even more amazing, is that Jonathan takes his robe off, the prince, the heir to the throne of Israel, and he gives it to David. Now, we don't normally realize maybe the significance of that. We get a little taste a number of centuries later when Haman is asked by who was that? Who was it? Was it Artaxerxes? Anyways, the king or the ruler of the Medes and Persians, what shall we do for Mordecai? Haman thinking he's the guy. No, what shall we, not for Mordecai. He didn't tell Haman it was for Mordecai. Haman thought it was for himself. How should we honor a person who the king really wants to honor? And Haman says, well, one of the things is put a robe on him that the king has worn. That was very symbolic, a robe the king has worn. Jonathan takes his robe off and gives it to Jonathan, almost stating, taking him from his shepherd clothes, which were pretty not what you'd go to see the King of England in, taking those and giving him his robe, with essentially saying, I'm making you either equal with myself or perhaps even putting you ahead of myself. I am clothing you with the robe worn by the one who is next in line for the throne of Israel. Now, when we look at Philippians, it states, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, count others as more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And we see here that Jonathan is looking at David as so significant, even more significant than himself, that he gives him all his armor and the robe that he has worn, his own robe. Another example of what it means to love your neighbor as your own soul. Now, we're going to come back to the point-by-point application at the end. That doesn't mean we should all be looking around seeing who we can give our shirts and stuff to right now, but there's a main principle here. Then Jonathan, in 1 Samuel chapter 20, has another meeting with David, and he says this, may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. Do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So let's take a look at this. The context here is that Jonathan was reasonably close to his father. In fact, Jonathan said, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And before we look at the next part, and just think back to what we just saw in the previous slide, Jonathan is in effect clearly indicating to David that he, Jonathan, will not be the next ruler of Israel. It will be David. And Jonathan is totally fine with that because he sees that that's what God desires. So he desires what God wants. And what God wants is for David to be the next king of Israel. And Jonathan, because he loves David as his own soul, is totally fine with that. He wants what is best, what God decrees should be happening, and what is best for David, and he is totally supportive of that. And he just asks for mercy that he not be killed, because it's almost a standard procedure that when a king took over from another king who has been nasty to him, you would wipe out that king and all his family. But Jonathan's requesting, please don't do that to me. And David and Jonathan do make that covenant, and David will not do that to Jonathan. And in fact, later on, Jonathan's son, David, takes him under his own roof. So back to this context of Jonathan and his father being relatively close in one sense. Maybe not, they're not, I think it's pretty hard to say that they were buddies, but on the other hand, Saul is grooming Jonathan to be the next king. So all the strategy, the plans, the thoughts, he does nothing without disclosing it to Jonathan. So an incident arises later on that same chapter where Jonathan is kind of going on the defensive for David at a meal. And this is when this occurs. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established." And we can infer from this that Jonathan is next in line. There's something else that immediately follows this. Before I move that, I just want to look at this bit. I want to look at this bit about Jonathan's mother. So there are very few characters in the Old Testament that basically there's nothing but positive said about them, and this is Jonathan. And when you look at the way Jonathan was and the way his father was, there's a huge difference. So you might ask yourself, Jonathan is a very noble character. He trusts God. He does not take matters into his own hands. And he's not at all like his father. So how did this happen? I suspect it was his mother. Sometimes people with serious issues like Saul have a way of, and they don't see their problem, and B, they'll project this onto other people around them and claim that that person has the issue. And I suspect that's the case here, that the real perverse and rebellious person in the room is Saul, and we see that from his track record. But his mother was probably a very impressive, godly woman. So, Jonathan then answers Saul, his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. His own son just tried to kill him on the spot right there at the meal. And so Jonathan knew, pretty obvious, that his father was determined to put David to death. If he hates David so badly that he's willing to kill his own son, because him and his son are in cahoots, then he knows for sure he wants to put David to death. So Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. I can understand the fierce anger, but what's shocking to me is that he's not concerned for himself. He's not grieved for himself. I mean, he is grieved for David because his father has disrespected his friend who he loves as his own soul, even though his father has just tried to kill him, and there would certainly be grounds for grieving in that. Wow. But he grieves for his friend David because his father has disrespected him. There is another example of loving your neighbor as yourself. I don't know why I'm getting emotional here. We're talking about big things, I guess, important things, and sometimes it's hard to just stay completely calm like Spock on Star Trek. But think about this for a second. How grieved are you when things are really coming off the rails for the people around you? It is possible that when you begin to grow in your relationship with God, that you will grow in your love for other people, such that you will see on the news some heinous example of just terrible things, and you will find yourself grieving for that person rather than just being disgusted with them. Grieving for the person who's done terrible things. No, David hadn't done terrible things, and he grieved for him. But it is possible. It's a supernatural effect that comes with loving God, is that you find yourself genuinely loving and being more concerned and grieving for other people than you might be for yourself. Okay, things are going from bad to worse. David is on the run now. While David was in Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Note that. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home. Note this. Jonathan loves David. He's abandoned his own right to the throne. He's also strengthening his friend in the Lord. He's a spiritual strengthener. And this is another thing that we can take home and say, what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? Is that how can we serve our neighbor in the Lord? How has God equipped us? What resources, what talents, what abilities? And what people specifically will he direct us to? He won't probably direct you to the entire world's population because you'd be completely out of resources in 5 seconds. But he will direct you to, he'll bring people into your lives who desires that you especially become the person who loves them as their own soul because they don't have anyone else. So what we observe here is a complete abandonment of Jonathan's right, so-called right to be king, coupled with a commitment to serve David, a commitment to serve David as future king. And this arose out of complete trust in God and a desire for God's will for his friend to be done. This is the kind of servanthood that I think we see that is a consequence of true love. By true love, I mean the real thing. The kind Christ commands us to have for one another is that we are willing to serve one another and abandon our own rights, and instead of being focused on what our rights are, focusing on instead on what our obligations are to other people around us. What are our obligations? Jonathan had no thought for his rights and every thought for his obligations before the Lord to David. Then Jonathan and his father and his brothers are all killed. And it states this in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Saul and Jonathan, David is saying, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. Now, I want to pause there. Why did David describe Jonathan that way? Well, look at David. I think this is one of the saddest statements. There's some sad statements made in the scriptures, and this is one of them. And it's not about Jonathan's love for David, but about David's relationship with his wives and his concubines. It appears that David's love, so-called love, for women appears to have been largely a lust for their bodies, for their physical aspects, rather than loving them as a living eternal soul. And the number of wives that David accumulated and concubines, which were kind of like a mistress, they weren't official wives, and their primary reason they were accumulated was for physical relationships. And then we add to that his sin against Bathsheba. We know that David, now there have been some suggestions I'm well aware of in my work at universities that some people would say there was a sketchy relationship going on here between Jonathan and David, and therefore, we should look at this as encouragement to be involved in those sorts of things ourselves. However, that's not at all the case. We know very clearly that David was a little too much attracted to women in the case of Bathsheba, and basically ordered her to come to his quarters, committed adultery against her and her husband, and then arranged for the murder of her husband. The life cost that David, what he's suggesting in this verse is that the cost to David was enormous, the life cost. He had never known what it is. He had forfeited, basically, with all his accumulated wives and he had forfeited ever having the kind of relationship that God designed a husband and a wife to have. Enormously fulfilling. And he forfeited that. That was the cost in what he did. Consequently, David never experienced the kind of love that God intended a husband and wife to experience, which is a connection at the level of the soul, the essence of a person, /personality, /mind, /character. Now, connecting with a person at the level of the soul and loving them is not just the realm of husbands and wives, but that kind of true love is, first of all, demonstrated by God to us. He wants to connect with us at the level of our eternal souls. You are first and foremost an eternal soul who's clothed in a body. And when you focus on the body rather than the soul, you can't really have the kind of true love that God designed us to have. Is the kind of love that parents might have for their children in many cases, and I realize probably not all of you have experienced that, but ideally that has happened and can happen and does. It has nothing to do with the physical, but everything to do with the connection at the level of the eternal soul. So keep that in mind, guys. I know as a young fellow, it's easy to start getting distracted by what your eyes see. But just remember there's a price to pay, and you don't want to forfeit something that of enormously greater value because of what you did. And that goes for husbands too. There's people checking out stuff online that is also has a cost to it, and that you forfeit again the kind of relationship that God intended a man to have with his wife. Just a little aside there. So when David defeated Goliath, Jonathan saw in David a man like himself who trusted God to an extraordinary degree. He loved David with a love that had nothing to do with the physical, but instead a true supernatural love at the level of the soul, the kind that Christ has for each one of us and as individuals throughout the centuries, and the kind that he asks us to have for every human being, loving our neighbor as our own soul. So observations and applications. He saw a need. By the way, I thought I was going to be done early, and look at this. I better speed her up. I'm almost done here. These are the closing. He saw a need and responded to it at great personal expense, clearly seeing David as more significant than himself. And that example number one of loving someone as your own soul. When forced to choose between a close but self-serving relationship with his father, his own father, or David's best interest, he chose to serve David at the expense of his standing before his own father and at risk of his own life. Number three, when both he and David were enormously disrespected, he grieved for David, not himself. He abandoned his own rights in exchange for committing to his obligations to David and to serving him. C.S. Lewis has an article in writes in Mere Christianity. What does it really mean when to love your neighbor? And he says it obviously can't mean to feel fond of your neighbor, because I don't feel fond of myself. So what does this really mean? And he summarizes it by stating this: but love in the Christian sense does not mean an emotion. It's a state not of the feelings, but of the will. That state of the will which we have naturally about ourselves we must learn to have about other people. Ask yourself, if I were sure that I loved God, what would I do? When you have found the answer, go and do it. So concluding application. Abandon whatever rights you think you have into the hands of God. You're not just tossing them, you're giving them into the hands of God. And instead, well, he's taking care of that. You focus on your obligations to other people within the context of God loving you, of you loving God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Depending upon a close relationship with God for your own well-being. He is your God. He is your shepherd. He is your protector, your provider, and your vindicator. He'll take care of that. It is only then that you will begin, and I emphasize begin, to truly love those people who are unlovable as your own soul.